CEO invited his ex to humiliate her. She arrived with twins and shattered his entire world. Dominic Kane believed he was a god among men. He thought his wedding day would be the final coat of paint over a past he was desperate to hide. A coronation where he could flaunt his billions and laugh in the face of the woman he once discarded like trash. He sent that invitation with a smirk, imagining her shame. But arrogance has a way of blinding men to the knives waiting in the dark. Dominic didn't know that while he was busy planning a spectacle, his ex-wife was busy buying his debt. He didn't know that the struggling woman he planned to mock held the keys to his entire kingdom. And he certainly didn't realize that by the time he said, "I do," he would have lost everything he ever loved. Hi, my beautiful story family. Welcome home to Mr. James Stories. If no one has asked you today, let me be the first to ask, how is your heart? I know the world can be loud and demanding, but here, in this quiet space we've built, you are safe. You are seen. You are deeply valued. Before we begin, receive this prayer like a shield against the noise. May every anxiety that tries to settle in your chest be replaced by a profound sense of peace. May the doors that have been closed in your face suddenly unlock, revealing opportunities you never thought possible. And may you realize, in your quietest moments, that your resilience is stronger than any storm. If you are receiving that blessing today, please type, "I receive" in the comments, so I know my family is with me. Family, before we dive in, I have a small, personal favor to ask, one that comes from a vulnerable place. There are voices in my life, even close to home, who doubted this journey. My own mother once said I wouldn't even reach the milestone we are approaching, that there wasn't an audience for stories told this way. But I believe she is wrong. I believe stories like this, stories of justice, redemption, and truth, deserve to be heard. Help me prove that these tales matter. If you are listening right now, please subscribe and help me show the doubters that we are strong. Let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Let's begin with love always. The afternoon sun sliced through the floor-to-ceiling glass of the Vanguard Capitol Tower, casting long, sharp shadows across the mahogany desk where Isabel Greer sat. At 32, Isabel had curated a life that felt less like an existence and more like a fortress. The air in her office was always cool, scented faintly with white tea and the crisp, metallic smell of high-end ink. 40 floors below, the city of Chicago churned in the humid grip of July, but up here, in the rarefied air of the crisis management elite, everything was silent, controlled, and expensive. Isabel signed the final page of the acquisition contract in front of her, the scratching of her fountain pen the only sound in the room. She didn't look up when the heavy oak door creaked open. She didn't have to. Only one person dared to enter her sanctuary without knocking. It arrived by courier 10 minutes ago, her assistant whispered, placing a thick, black velvet envelope on the corner of the desk. He insisted it be placed directly in your hands. He said it was personal. Isabel capped her pen with a precise click. She stared at the envelope. It was ridiculous, ostentatious, and desperate for attention, much like the man she suspected had sent it. The velvet was crushed, heavy, and embroidered with gold thread. It looked less like a wedding invitation and more like a summons to a royal execution. She reached out, her fingers, adorned only by a simple, terrifyingly expensive emerald ring, brushing the fabric. She knew that handwriting. Even after 10 years of silence, 10 years of building an empire from the ashes of the life he had burned to the ground, she recognized the arrogant slant of the letters. Ms. Isabel Greer. She sliced the envelope open with a letter opener that looked more like a dagger. Inside, the card was heavy enough to break a window. Gold leaf lettering announced the marriage of Dominic Kane, CEO of Kane Dynamics, to Miss Serafina Sterling. Isabel's expression didn't shift. She had known this was coming. Her analysts had been tracking Dominic's erratic spending for months. A wedding to the Sterling heiress was his last desperate play to secure the capital he needed to save his failing company. To the world, Dominic was a titan of industry. To Isabel, who secretly owned 30% of his distressed debt through shell companies, he was a drowning man grasping at a life raft made of tulle and old money. But it wasn't the invitation that made her pause. It was the handwritten note scrawled on the back in blue ink. Isabel, I thought you should see what real success looks like. Come if you dare. It might be educational for you to see what you missed out on. Try not to embarrass yourself if you do attend. D. A cold, dry laugh escaped Isabel's lips. It was a sound devoid of humor, sharp as breaking glass. Educational, she whispered to the empty room. He still saw her as the girl in the thrift store coat. He still saw her as the 22-year-old waitress he had thrown out into a blizzard because she didn't fit his brand. He had no idea that the woman reading his note could buy his entire venue and turn it into a parking lot before the appetizers were served. He thought he was the hunter, luring a wounded animal into a trap to humiliate her one last time. He didn't know he had just sent a VIP invitation to the predator who held the deed to his cage. Isabel swiveled her chair around to face the window. Her reflection stared back, impeccable, armored in Italian silk, eyes hard and dark. But in the glass, she saw another reflection behind her. Two boys, 10 years old, were sitting quietly on the leather sofa in the corner of her office, reading textbooks that were far too advanced for their grade level. Leo and Julian. They had Dominic's dark curls, his sharp jawline, and his terrifying intellect. But they had her eyes, and unlike their father, they possessed a soul. Leo looked up, sensing the shift in the room's energy. Is it him? Isabel turned back to her sons. She didn't lie to them. She never had. Yes, it's an invitation. To the wedding? Julian asked, closing his book on advanced macroeconomics. The one you told us was happening this weekend? Yes. Are we going? Leo asked. His voice was steady, devoid of the childish fear that usually accompanied such questions. He sounded like a board member asking about a merger. Isabel looked down at the velvet envelope, then at the foreclosure documents sitting in her locked drawer, the documents that would legally transfer ownership of Kane Dynamics to Vanguard Capital at 5 p.m. on the day of the wedding if the debt wasn't serviced. Dominic wanted a show. He wanted to parade his new, young, wealthy bride in front of the trash he had discarded. He wanted to prove that he had won. Isabel stood up, smoothing the fabric of her skirt. She walked over to the boys and placed a hand on each of their shoulders. We aren't just going, Isabel said, a dangerous smile finally touching her lips. We are going to give your father exactly what he asked for. He wants us to see what we missed out on. Fine. But first, he's going to see exactly what he threw away. She picked up the internal phone line. Get the car ready. And call the vault. I need the emeralds. All of them. Little did Dominic know, the blizzard he had thrown her into 10 years ago hadn't killed her. It had frozen her heart into a weapon, and she was finally coming home to use it. The memory of that night 10 years ago didn't return to Isabel as a thought. It returned as a physical sensation. It was the stinging cold of a Chicago blizzard that rattled the windows of the cramped studio apartment she and Dominic had shared for 3 years. The heating had broken 2 days prior, but Dominic hadn't noticed. He had been too busy celebrating his first 6-figure contract, the deal that would launch Kane Dynamics. Isabel remembered the sound of his key in the lock, aggressive, sharp, victorious. She had been sitting on the edge of the mattress, wrapped in 3 blankets, holding a positive pregnancy test in her trembling hand. She had practiced how she would tell him. She had imagined his smile, the way his eyes would crinkle at the corners, the way he would promise that his new success meant they could finally afford a crib, a heater, a life. But when Dominic walked in, he wasn't smiling. He was wearing a brand new Italian suit that cost more than their entire year's rent, the fabric dark and sleek against the peeling wallpaper of their entryway. He looked at the apartment with a sneer of undisguised disgust. Then he looked at her. And for the first time in their relationship, Isabel realized he was looking at her with the same expression. Pack your things, he said. No hello. No celebration. Just a command delivered with the flat indifference of a CEO firing an intern. Isabel blinked, clutching the blankets tighter. What? Dom, what are you talking about? I said pack, Dominic repeated, checking his reflection in the cracked hallway mirror. He adjusted his silk tie, admiring the knot. I'm moving out tonight. I've leased a penthouse in the Gold Coast. And obviously, you aren't coming. The air left the room. I don't understand, she whispered. We're partners. I worked double shifts to pay for your prototypes. I edited your pitch decks until my eyes burned. We did this together. Dominic laughed. It was a cruel, barking sound. We? There is no we anymore, Isabel. Look at you. He gestured vaguely at her oversized sweater and messy hair. You're an anchor. You're small. You're ordinary. I'm building a billion-dollar brand. I need a partner who looks the part, who knows how to hold a champagne glass without shaking. You served your purpose when I was a nobody, but I'm somebody now. Isabel stood up, the pregnancy test burning against her palm. Dominic, please. You're just stressed. You don't mean this. Besides, there's something I need to tell you. He sighed, checking his Rolex. Make it quick. The movers are coming in 10 minutes. I'm pregnant, she said, her voice shaking. We're going to have a baby. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Dominic stared at her, his face unreadable. For a second, just a split second, she hoped. Then, his face twisted into a mask of pure malice. You really are pathetic, aren't you? What? Trying to trap me? He stepped closer, looming over her. You see me finally making it, finally getting the life I deserve, and you decide to invent a pregnancy to keep your claws in my wallet? It's a desperate lie, Isabel. And frankly, it's beneath even you. I'm not lying, she cried, holding out the test. Look, he slapped her hand away. The plastic stick clattered across the linoleum floor, sliding under the radiator. I don't care, he hissed. Even if it were true, which it isn't, I wouldn't want it. I don't want anything that ties me to this gutter. I don't want anything that ties me to you. He walked to the door and held it open. The wind howled from the hallway, carrying snow into the room. Get out. Now, before I call the police and have you removed as a trespasser. Isabel looked at him, searching for the man she had loved. But that man was gone, consumed by the monster in the expensive suit. She grabbed her coat and her purse. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She simply walked past him into the freezing night, the snow instantly soaking through her thin boots. You're nothing, he shouted after her as she descended the stairs. You'll always be nothing. As the heavy door slammed shut behind her, locking her out of the only warmth she had known, Isabel placed a hand on her stomach. She was alone, homeless, and freezing. But as the wind tore at her face, a strange, cold resolve settled in her chest. He was wrong. She wasn't nothing. She was the mother of his children. And one day, she would make sure that the door he just slammed would be the only thing standing between him and total ruin. The silence of Isabel's office in the present day was far warmer than that blizzard, but the coldness in her eyes remained. She placed the wedding invitation into her drawer and locked it with a definitive click. Ms. Greer. Isabel looked up. Marcus, her chief financial officer, stood in the doorway. He was a man of few words and even fewer emotions, which was exactly why Isabel trusted him with her life's work. He held a leather-bound folio against his chest. The updated financials on Kane Dynamics, Marcus said, placing the file on her desk. It's worse than we thought. Isabel opened the folder. The numbers were bleeding red. Explain. He's leveraging everything on this merger with the Sterling family, Marcus said, sitting opposite her. He's borrowed against the company's future earnings, against the patent portfolio, even against the physical headquarters. If the wedding doesn't happen, or if the Sterling dowry doesn't hit his accounts by Monday morning, he defaults. And the debt we purchased? Isabel asked, tracing the columns of figures with a manicured fingernail. We hold the senior secured notes, Marcus confirmed. Technically, since he missed the covenant payment last Tuesday, we have the right to accelerate the debt immediately. We could file for foreclosure this afternoon. Security could escort him out of his building before dinner. Isabel leaned back in her chair, a ghost of a smile playing on her lips. It would be so easy. A single phone call, a single signature, and Dominic Kane would be destitute. It was the justice she had fantasized about for a decade. But it wasn't enough. Foreclosing on a Tuesday afternoon was a business transaction. It was impersonal. Dominic wouldn't understand why it was happening. He would blame the market, or his lawyers, or bad luck. He needed to know it was her. He needed to feel the ground crumble beneath his feet at the exact moment he thought he was flying. No, Isabel said softly. Not today. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Every day we wait, the asset depreciates. His management is erratic. He's spending company funds on this wedding like a drunken sailor. Let him spend, Isabel commanded. Let him build the stage. Let him gather the audience. Let him invite every senator, every investor, and every journalist in Chicago to witness his triumph. She stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city skyline. Somewhere out there, Dominic was probably getting a massage or fitting a tuxedo, thinking he had fooled the world. He had no idea that the mystery investor, who had been quietly buying up his bad loans, wasn't a faceless hedge fund in the Caymans. He called me nothing, Isabel whispered to the glass, her breath fogging the pain. He told me I didn't fit his aesthetic. So, I'm going to ruin him in the most beautiful setting possible. She turned back to Marcus. Prepare the foreclosure papers, but date them for Saturday, 5 p.m. The time of the ceremony? Marcus asked. Exactly, Isabel said. I want to hand them to him personally. I want to look him in the eye when he realizes that the trash he threw out now owns the roof over his head. Little did Dominic know, the check he was waiting for from his bride wasn't going to clear, and the woman he had invited to humiliate was bringing something far more dangerous than a wedding gift. She was bringing the twins he claimed didn't exist, and the bill for 10 years of pain, with interest. Dominic Kane stared at his reflection in the gilded mirror of his bridal suite, trying to convince himself that the man looking back was a king. The tuxedo was Tom Ford, custom-fitted to his broad shoulders. The cufflinks were diamond, a gift from Serafina. His hair was perfectly coiffed, graying slightly at the temples in a way the magazines called distinguished. But if one looked closer, past the expensive grooming, the cracks were visible. There were dark circles under his eyes that concealer couldn't quite hide. A slight tremor in his hand as he reached for his scotch. You look like $1 billion, Dom, his best friend and lawyer, Silas, lied from the couch. Dominic downed the drink in one gulp. I need to look like $2 billion, Silas. That's what the shareholders expect. Silas stood up, closing the door to ensure privacy. The festive noise of the rehearsal dinner downstairs was muffled, but the tension in the room was screaming. Speaking of shareholders, we have a problem. Dominic spun around, his veneer of calm cracking. Not today, Silas. I don't want problems today. I'm getting married in 48 hours. It's the mystery investor, Silas said, his voice dropping to a hush. The one holding the Series B notes. They didn't sign the waiver for the missed payment. Dominic scoffed, pouring another drink. They're bluffing. They want a better rate. Who is it? BlackRock? Vanguard? We don't know, Silas admitted, looking pale. It's a shell company. Nemesis Holdings. They've been totally silent. But Dom, if they don't sign that waiver by Saturday, they can call the loan. The entire $40 million. We don't have the cash. We will have the cash. Dominic snapped, slamming his glass down. Once I marry Serafina, her trust fund merges with my personal assets. It's a liquidity injection of $50 million instantly. That's why this wedding has to be perfect. That's why the press has to see a fairy tale. The moment we say I do, the balance sheet is fixed. He walked to the window, looking down at the sprawling estate he had rented for the weekend. He needed this. He needed the world to see him as Dominic Kane, the untouchable titan. He couldn't go back to being the nobody from the South Side. He couldn't go back to that cold apartment with the peeling wallpaper. What about the ex? Silas asked tentatively. You really sent the invite? A cruel smile returned to Dominic's face. Isabel? Yes. I want her to see this. I want her to see Serafina, young, beautiful, rich. I want Isabel to stand in the back in her cheap dress and realize that I was right to dump her. Is that smart, Dom? Provoking her. She's a waitress, Silas. Or a secretary. Whatever she is, she's harmless. She's the past. Serafina is the future. Dominic adjusted his tie, the tremor in his hand steadying as his arrogance took over again. He convinced himself that he was invincible. He convinced himself that the silence from Nemesis Holdings was submission, not a predator waiting to strike. He had no idea that the harmless woman from his past was currently selecting a dress that cost more than his car, and that Nemesis wasn't just a random name for a holding company. It was a promise. As Dominic headed downstairs to toast his future, he didn't notice the storm clouds gathering on the horizon, the same dark gray clouds that had covered the city the night he threw his wife into the snow. The storm was returning, and this time, he had nowhere to hide. Saturday arrived with the heavy, humid pressure of a storm waiting to break. In the private dressing room of Chicago's most exclusive atelier, Isabel stood before a trifold mirror, examining her reflection with the critical eye of a general inspecting troops before deployment. The dress was not merely a garment. It was a statement of war. It was a custom creation, midnight blue velvet that absorbed the light rather than reflecting it, cut with a neckline that was daring yet impeccably sophisticated. It hugged her silhouette like a second skin, trailing into a train that rippled like dark water around her heels. It was the kind of dress that didn't just ask for attention, it demanded submission. "It fits perfectly, Ms. Greer," the designer murmured, adjusting the hem with trembling hands. She knew who Isabel was. She knew that the woman standing in her showroom could destroy a reputation with a single whisper. "Do you need jewelry?" "I have my own," Isabel replied. She opened the velvet case her bodyguard had placed on the vanity. Inside lay the Empress Suite, a necklace and earring set of Colombian emeralds and diamonds that she had purchased at auction in Geneva 3 months ago. The price tag had been 7 figures, paid in cash. Isabel lifted the necklace. The cold stones settled against her skin, heavy and grounding. 10 years ago, the only jewelry she owned was a thin gold band that Dominic had bought at a pawn shop, a ring he had demanded back the night he threw her out, claiming she hadn't earned it. "He told me I needed to look the part," Isabel whispered to her reflection. She fastened the clasp, the emeralds blazing against the dark blue velvet. "Well, Dominic, do I look the part now?" She didn't look like a wife. She didn't look like a mother. She looked like a queen who had returned to burn down the village that exiled her. Her phone buzzed on the marble counter. It was a text from Marcus. "The paperwork is ready. The process server is disguised as a member of the catering staff. Signal when you want the delivery." Isabel smiled, applying a coat of deep crimson lipstick. The color was vendetta. "Wait for my signal," she typed back. "Let him cut the cake first. I want him to taste the sweetness before he chokes on the ash." She turned to leave, the silk lining of her dress rustling like dry leaves. She wasn't just walking into a wedding. She was walking into a courtroom where she was the judge, the jury, and the executioner. While Isabel donned her armor, Leo and Julian were in the living room of their penthouse, engaged in a silent battle of their own. A chessboard sat between them, the pieces carved from obsidian and ivory. "Checkmate in 3, Leo said calmly, moving his knight. "Unless I sacrifice the rook," Julian countered, his eyes narrowing. At 10 years old, the twins were unnerving to most adults. They possessed a stillness that children shouldn't have, a watchful intensity that missed nothing. They had inherited their father's terrifying intellect, the ability to see patterns, to predict outcomes, to manipulate variables. But where Dominic used that intelligence for greed, Isabel had taught them to use it for survival. "Boys," Isabel said, stepping into the room. The twins looked up, and for the first time in hours, their composure broke. Their eyes widened. "You look." Leo searched for the word, his young mind grasping for a description that fit the terrifying beauty of his mother. "Dangerous. That's the point," Isabel said, smoothing Julian's hair. She looked at her sons, dressed in matching bespoke tuxedos that cost more than most cars. They were the spitting image of Dominic. The same dark curls, the same sharp noses, the same way they held their chins high when challenged. They were the evidence Dominic claimed didn't exist. They were the lie he had accused her of telling. "Do you remember the plan?" Isabel asked, kneeling to look them in the eye. "We are polite," Julian recited, adjusting his bow tie. "We don't run. We don't shout. And when people ask who we are, we tell the truth," Leo said, a glint of steel in his dark eyes. "We tell them our last name is Kane." Isabel's heart tightened with a fierce, protective love. She hated that she had to bring them into this arena, to expose them to the man who had rejected them before they were even born. But they deserved to know. And Dominic deserved to see exactly what he had lost. "He's going to deny us, isn't he?" Julian asked quietly. "The man. Our father. He might," Isabel admitted, her voice hardening. "He is a man who has built a castle out of lies. When he sees the truth standing in front of him, he might try to close his eyes." "Let him try," Leo said, standing up and buttoning his jacket. He looked so much like Dominic in that moment that it stole the breath from Isabel's lungs. "Checkmate, Mom. We're ready." Little did Dominic know, he wasn't just facing an angry ex-wife. He was facing 2 grandmasters in the making, and the game had already started. Across the city, in the bridal suite of the Grand Estate, Serafina Sterling was screaming. "I said hydrangeas, not peonies," she shrieked, throwing a bouquet across the room. It hit the wall with a wet thud, scattering petals over the antique Persian rug. "Do you know how much this wedding costs? Do you know who I am?" The terrified florist scrambled to pick up the flowers. "I'm sorry, Miss Sterling. We'll fix it." Serafina turned back to the mirror, her hands shaking as she lit a cigarette. Her bridesmaids, a gaggle of socialites in unfortunate pastel dresses, looked away nervously. Serafina was 24, beautiful in a sharp, brittle way, and terrifyingly ambitious. To the public, she was the heiress to the sterling shipping fortune. She was the perfect match for the billionaire Dominic Kane, a merger of two great American dynasties. But Serafina had a secret, one that clawed at her insides every time she swiped her credit card. The sterling fortune was gone. Her father had gambled it away on bad crypto investments and worse horses 3 years ago. The family was living on credit, fumes, and the illusion of wealth. They were technically bankrupt. This wedding wasn't a celebration of love, it was a rescue mission. Dominic Kane was her golden parachute. She needed his billions to pay off her father's debts before the banks seized their estate in the Hamptons. She needed his liquidity to keep up the charade. He looked worried yesterday, her mother whispered, coming up behind her to adjust the veil. Dominic. He was on the phone with his lawyers. He's a CEO, mother. He's always on the phone, Serafina snapped, exhaling a plume of smoke. Besides, the prenup guarantees me $10 million if we divorce after 5 years. I just have to tolerate him for 60 months. And if he finds out we're broke? He won't, Serafina said, admiring the 10-carat diamond on her finger. Men like Dominic only see what they want to see. He sees a trophy. He sees a pedigree. He doesn't look at the balance sheet. She crushed the cigarette out in a crystal ashtray. Is the ex-wife coming? The one he laughed about. The guest list says yes, her mother confirmed. Isabel Greer. Serafina sneered. Good. Let her come. Let her see me in a $50,000 Vera Wang gown. Let her see what a real woman looks like. She's probably some haggard, bitter waitress. Serafina checked her reflection one last time. She looked perfect. She looked rich. She looked safe. She had no idea that the man waiting for her at the altar was just as desperate as she was. They were two drowning swimmers grabbing onto each other, convinced the other was a life preserver. And neither of them knew that the shark was already in the water, wearing midnight blue velvet and holding the paperwork that would sink them both. While the bride and groom prepared their masks for the world, Isabel sat in the silence of her car, the city blurring past the tinted windows. She wasn't looking at the streets of Chicago. She was looking backward, through the tunnel of time to a night that still haunted her dreams. It was 7 months after the blizzard. Isabel lay in a charity ward at St. Jude's Hospital, the air smelling of antiseptic and despair. There were no private rooms here, no flowers, no husbands holding hands. Just a row of beds separated by thin, yellowing curtains and the sound of women weeping in pain or loneliness. She had been in labor for 14 hours. Every contraction felt like a wave trying to pull her under, and with every wave, she whispered his name. Dominic. It was a reflex, a phantom limb syndrome of the heart. Part of her still foolishly hoped he would burst through the doors, breathless and apologetic, ready to claim his family. But the doors only opened for overworked nurses. When the twins finally arrived, first Leo, screaming with a lung capacity that startled the doctor, then Julian, silent and wide-eyed. Isabel held them against her chest. They were so small, fragile. They were two tiny heartbeats in a world that had already decided they didn't matter. Do you have a name for the father? The nurse asked, hovering over the birth certificate with a clipboard. For the records? Isabel looked down at her sons. She traced the curve of Leo's jaw, identical to the man who had called her a liar. She remembered Dominic's words. I don't want anything that ties me to this gutter. No, Isabel whispered, her voice cracking. No, father. The nurse gave her a pitying look, the kind reserved for unwed mothers and charity cases, and walked away. That look ignited a fire in Isabel's belly hotter than the pain of childbirth. She looked at the peeling paint on the ceiling, at the thin blanket covering her children, and she made a vow. It wasn't a prayer, it was a contract with the universe. He called us nothing, she whispered to the sleeping infants, kissing their foreheads. He thinks we are trash to be discarded. But I promise you this. I will build a world so big, so bright, and so impenetrable that he will spend the rest of his life standing outside the gates, begging to be let in. 10 years later, in the plush leather seat of her Rolls-Royce, Isabel touched the emerald necklace at her throat. She had kept that promise. She had clawed her way up from the charity ward to the boardroom, fueled by the memory of that pitying look. Dominic thought he was the architect of his own success. He didn't realize that every skyscraper he built, every deal he signed, Isabel was there in the shadows, watching, waiting, and quietly buying the foundation out from under him. The Kane Sterling wedding was being held at the Vanderbilt estate, a sprawling Gothic mansion on the shores of Lake Michigan. It was a venue that screamed old money, which was exactly why Dominic had chosen it. He was obsessed with erasing the stain of his poverty, with proving that he belonged among the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers. The reception garden was a masterpiece of excess. Thousands of white orchids had been flown in from Singapore. A string quartet played Debussy near a fountain filled with champagne. Waiters in white gloves circulated with trays of caviar, moving like ghosts among the guests. Dominic stood near the entrance of the ballroom, surrounded by his groomsmen, a collection of bankers and investors he called friends, but who were really just business leverage. "The spread is incredible, Dom," Silas said, looking around nervously. "But are you sure about the guest list adjustment?" Dominic laughed, adjusting his cufflinks. He felt invincible today. The sun was shining, the press was snapping photos, and in an hour, he would be married to a Sterling. "You mean Isabel?" Dominic smirked. "Silas, relax. It's a power move. You invite the past to show it how far you've come. Besides, she won't show. She doesn't have the spine. And if she does?" Another groomsman asked, a hedge fund manager named Trent. "I heard she's doing okay. Some sort of consulting gig." "Consulting?" Dominic scoffed, taking a sip of scotch. "She probably answers phones for a crisis firm. Look, Isabel is a mouse. I threw her out into a snowstorm, and she didn't even fight back. She just walked away. That's who she is. Weak. If she comes today, she'll stand in the back, eat the free food, and realize she made a mistake trying to trap me." He looked out over the perfectly manicured lawn, imagining Isabel cowering in the corner in a department store dress. "She needs to see this," Dominic continued, his voice dropping to a cruel whisper. "She needs to see that you can't polish trash. I upgraded. Serafina is a thoroughbred. Isabel was just practice." The groomsmen laughed, the sound ugly and jagged against the beautiful music. Dominic joined in, raising his glass to his own reflection in the window. Little did he know, the mouse he was mocking was currently 3 miles away, flanked by a motorcade that would make the president jealous. And she wasn't coming to eat the food. She was coming to foreclose on the kitchen. The interior of the Rolls-Royce Phantom was silent as a tomb. The partition was up, separating Isabel and the twins from the driver. The only sound was the hum of the engine and the rhythmic tapping of Julian's finger against his knee. "We're 5 minutes out," Isabel said, breaking the silence. Her voice was calm, but underneath it lay a current of high-voltage electricity. She turned to face her sons. They sat rigid in their tuxedos, looking less like children and more like miniature soldiers preparing for battle. "Let's review the rules of engagement," Isabel said. "Rule 1, Leo said, his voice dropping an octave to mimic his mother's boardroom tone. "We are not props. We are evidence." "Correct," Isabel nodded. "Your father claimed you didn't exist. Your presence alone proves he is a liar. You don't need to do anything but stand there and be his sons." "Rule 2, Julian added, fixing his cufflink. "Emotion is a weakness he will try to exploit. If he yells, we go silent. If he lies, we present facts." "And Rule 3, Isabel asked, looking at them both with fierce pride. "We don't leave until you say it's finished," Leo said. "We don't let him intimidate us. We remember who owns the building." Isabel smiled, a genuine warmth breaking through her armor for a split second. "That's right. He thinks he's the king of the castle. But he's just a tenant who hasn't paid rent in 10 years. The car began to slow. Through the tinted windows, Isabel could see the iron gates of the Vanderbilt estate looming ahead. Security guards with earpieces were checking the guest list, turning away anyone who didn't look important enough. Isabel reached into her clutch and checked the black velvet envelope one last time. Inside, next to the foreclosure notice, was a photo. It was grainy, taken from a security camera 10 years ago, the image of Dominic pushing a pregnant woman out of a door. She had saved it for a decade. "Are you ready to meet him?" she asked softly. Leo looked out the window at the mansion that was built on a foundation of debt and lies. "I'm not just ready to meet him," the 10-year-old said, his eyes cold. "I'm ready to evict him." The car turned into the driveway, the gravel crunching under the tires like the sound of bones breaking. The lioness had entered the den, and she had brought her cubs to watch the kill. The sky above the Vanderbilt estate had turned the color of a bruised plum, heavy with unspilt rain. To the wedding planner, it was a disaster waiting to happen. To Isabel, it was perfect atmospheric lighting. The motorcade of guests had created a line of gleaming metal snaking up the driveway. Bentleys, Mercedes, and vintage Jaguars jockeying for position. But when Isabel's Phantom glided past the secondary security checkpoint, the other drivers instinctively gave way. There is a hierarchy in the world of wealth. There is rich, and then there is power. The sleek, black beast carrying Isabel Greer smelled of power. Inside the car, Isabel adjusted the emeralds around her neck one final time. The stones were cold against her skin, a sharp contrast to the adrenaline heating her blood. "Remember," she said to the twins, her voice barely a whisper. "Chin up, eyes forward. You belong here more than he does." The car came to a smooth halt at the foot of the limestone steps leading to the garden terrace. A valet, a young man in a white jacket who looked terrified of scratching the paint, rushed to open the rear door. The air that rushed in was thick with humidity, and the scent of expensive perfume mingled with impending rain. Isabel took a breath. It tasted like ozone and victory. She turned her legs, and the first thing to hit the pavement was a stiletto heel, sharp enough to puncture a lung. It was a Christian Louboutin, the red sole flashing like a warning signal against the gray stone. Isabel rose from the car, the midnight blue velvet of her gown cascading around her. She stood to her full height, ignoring the valet's outstretched hand. She didn't need help. She hadn't needed help in 10 years. Then, she turned back to the car and extended her hand. Leo, Julian. One by one, the twins stepped out. They moved with a synchronized grace that was almost eerie, flanking their mother like royal guards. The wind caught their dark curls, tossing them in the exact same manner it used to toss Dominic's. For a moment, they just stood there at the bottom of the stairs, a woman made of steel and silk, and two boys who looked like the ghosts of the groom's past. "Let's go," Isabel said. She began to ascend the stairs, the sound of her heels clicking against the stone like the ticking of a bomb, counting down to 0. Little did the guests above know, the explosion wasn't going to be loud. It was going to be silent, and it was going to level everything. The reception garden was a sea of pastel silks, linen suits, and forced laughter. Waiters navigated the crowd with silver trays, while the string quartet fought a losing battle against the rising wind. When Isabel reached the top of the stairs and stepped onto the terrace, the change in the atmosphere was instantaneous. It didn't start with a shout. It started with a ripple of silence that spread outward from the entrance. First, the guests nearest the stairs stopped talking, their eyes widening as they took in the woman in midnight blue. Then, the people they were talking to turned to see what had captured their attention. Within 30 seconds, the chatter of 300 people had died down to a murmur, the silence rolling across the lawn like a wave. Isabel paused at the edge of the terrace, allowing the moment to stretch. She knew exactly what picture she presented. She wasn't the discarded ex Dominic had described to his friends. She was a vision of dark glamour, a stark contrast to the frothy, light aesthetics of the wedding. "Who is that?" A woman in a pink fascinator whispered loudly. "Is that a model? Or a movie star?" "Look at the necklace," her companion hissed. "Those are real emeralds. That's an estate piece. You don't rent jewelry like that." Isabel moved through the crowd, the sea of bodies parting for her without her having to say a word. She walked with the easy confidence of someone who owned the mortgage on the ground beneath their feet. Leo and Julian walked beside her, their faces impassive, their dark eyes scanning the crowd with an intensity that unnerved the adults they passed. As they neared the VIP section near the fountain, a gray-haired man in a bespoke suit froze mid-sip of his martini. It was Senator Sterling, the bride's uncle, a man Isabel had bailed out of a PR crisis 2 years ago involving a mistress and a wiretap. He squinted, lowering his glass. Then, his face went pale. "My God," the senator whispered to the man beside him. "That's not a model. That's Isabel Greer." "Who?" "The owner of Vanguard Capital," the senator hissed, looking terrified. "The Iron Lady of restructuring. She's the one who saved my career. What on earth is she doing here?" "She looks predatory," the other man noted. "She is," the senator replied, watching Isabel glide toward the groom's party. If she's here, someone is about to die. Or go bankrupt. Usually both. Isabel caught the senator's eye and offered him a microscopic nod. He spilled his drink on his shoes. She smiled. The first domino had fallen. Now for the king. Dominic Kane was standing on a raised dais near the altar, holding court with a group of potential investors. He felt magnificent. The wind was picking up, messing with the tablecloths, but he felt like he could command the elements to stop. The numbers for next quarter are going to be explosive, Dominic lied smoothly, gesturing with his champagne flute. Once the merger is complete, Kane Dynamics will be untouchable. He was laughing at his own joke when he noticed the silence. It was an odd, heavy quiet that pricked at the back of his neck. He frowned, looking out over the garden. The guests weren't looking at him. They were all looking toward the fountain. Dominic followed their gaze, annoyed that someone was stealing his spotlight. Probably Serafina making a dramatic entrance, he thought. She loved attention almost as much as he did. But it wasn't Serafina. Through a gap in the crowd, he saw a flash of midnight blue velvet. A woman was standing near the ice sculpture, her back to him. Her posture was regal, her dark hair swept up in an elegant chignon that exposed the nape of her neck. Dominic's heart gave a strange, stuttering thump. He knew that neck. He knew the curve of those shoulders. But it was impossible. Then, the woman turned. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. The champagne glass slipped from Dominic's fingers. It hit the marble floor of the dais with a shattering crash that echoed like a gunshot in the sudden silence. Shards of crystal skittered across his polished shoes, soaking his socks in expensive vintage bubbly. Dominic didn't notice. He couldn't breathe. It was Isabel. But it wasn't the Isabel he remembered. The Isabel he knew wore oversized sweaters to hide her thin frame. She had anxious eyes and bitten fingernails. She was soft, malleable, pathetic. This woman was a statue carved from obsidian. She was glowing with a terrifying, cold radiance. The emeralds at her throat were massive, worth more than the engagement ring he had put on Serafina's finger. "Dom?" Silas asked, grabbing his arm. "Dom, what's wrong? You look like you've seen a ghost." Dominic choked, his voice failing him. And then he saw them. Two boys stepped out from behind Isabel's dress. They stood on either side of her, looking up at the dais with dark, unblinking eyes. Dominic felt the blood drain from his face so fast he nearly fainted. He gripped the railing for support. He recognized the tilt of the head on the boy to the left. He recognized the scowl on the boy to the right. He was looking into a mirror that reflected 10 years into the past. "No," Dominic whispered, the words scraping out of his throat. That's not possible. He had told everyone she was lying. He had told himself she was lying. But looking at those boys was like looking at a DNA test printed in flesh and blood. Across the garden, Isabel locked eyes with him. She didn't wave. She didn't smile. She simply raised her chin, challenging him to look away. He had invited her to humiliate her. He had invited her to show her what she had missed. But as he stared at the two sons he had abandoned, standing next to the woman who looked like she owned the very air he was breathing, Dominic realized with a sickening lurch that he was the one who was about to be destroyed. The silence in the garden stretched thin, threatening to snap. Dominic stood frozen on the dais, champagne dripping from his cuff onto the white marble, staring at the ghosts of his own making. But the guests were not frozen. They were beginning to whisper. It started as a low hum, like bees in a hive disturbed by a sudden intruder, and then it grew louder as heads turned from the groom to the two boys standing by the fountain. The resemblance wasn't just passing, it was forensic. Leo, seemingly bored by the attention, tilted his head to the left as he surveyed the crowd. It was a distinctive, unconscious tick, a sharp angle of the chin, eyes narrowing in assessment. On the dais, Dominic was doing the exact same thing as he stared at them. "Look at the jawline," a society matron murmured behind her fan. "It's identical." "And the eyes," her husband added, adjusting his glasses. "Those are Kane eyes, cold as ice." Silas, the best man, stepped forward to shield Dominic from the growing scrutiny, but it was too late. The visual connection had been made. The guests were doing the math. 10 years since the company started, 10-year-old boys. The timeline fit perfectly with the rumors of Dominic's humble beginnings. Dominic felt the walls of his carefully constructed reality beginning to buckle. He had spent a decade crafting a narrative that he was a self-made bachelor, a lone wolf who had sacrificed everything for his company. He had erased Isabel, He had erased the pregnancy. But biology does not erase easily. Julian looked up at the dais, locking eyes with the man who had called him a lie. The boy didn't smile. He didn't wave. He simply stood with his hands clasped behind his back, a posture Dominic himself adopted during board meetings. He's not going to acknowledge them, Serafina's mother whispered loudly from the front row, clutching her pearls. Tell me he isn't going to ignore his own flesh and blood. Dominic heard the whisper. It cut through him like a knife. He realized with a jolt of panic that he was losing the audience. He needed to regain control. He needed to spin this. He forced a smile onto his face, a brittle, terrifying thing. He signaled the string quartet to play louder, trying to drown out the truth with Mozart. But the music only made the tension more cinematic. He had to get them out of there. He had to corner Isabel and force her to leave before the press photographers, who were currently changing lenses to get a better zoom, realized what was happening. Dominic stepped down from the dais, his movements jerky. He was marching toward war, unaware that he was walking unarmed toward a nuclear power. Dominic intercepted Isabel near the ice sculpture of a swan, grabbing her elbow with enough force to bruise. He steered her sharply away from the main crowd, toward a secluded alcove of hydrangeas. What do you think you're doing? He hissed, his voice trembling with a cocktail of rage and fear. Isabel didn't flinch. She looked down at his hand on her arm, her expression one of mild distaste, as if a stray dog had brushed against her couture. Unhand me, Dominic, she said. Her voice was low, smooth, and utterly devoid of the fear he remembered. This is silk velvet. You can't afford to replace it. Dominic snatched his hand back as if burned. He looked her up and down, his eyes raking over the gown, the emeralds, the flawless skin. He was looking for a flaw, a loose thread, a crack in the facade that would prove she was still the poor girl he had evicted. You have some nerve, he spat, leaning in close so the guests wouldn't hear. Showing up here? With them. He gestured vaguely toward the twins, who were standing 10 feet away, watching the interaction with the intensity of bodyguards. You invited me, Isabel reminded him, reaching into her clutch. She pulled out the velvet envelope. Come see what you missed out on. Isn't that what you wrote? I meant for you to come and see my success. Dominic whispered furiously. I didn't mean for you to rent a costume and drag. Those children. Here to stage a scene. Those children, Isabel repeated, the temperature in the alcove dropping 10 degrees. Yes. Who are they? Some actors you hired? Or did you find some poor sap to pin them on after I threw you out? Dominic laughed, but his eyes were darting around nervously. You think you can come here, dressed up in rented jewelry, and trick people into thinking you're someone? I know who you are, Isabel. You're a waitress. You're nothing. He waited for her to crumble. He waited for the tears, the apologies, the begging. That was the dynamic. He was the hammer. She was the nail. But Isabel didn't crumble. She stepped closer to him, invading his space until he could smell the scent of her perfume, white tea and vengeance. Rent? She asked, arching a perfect eyebrow. Oh, Dominic, you really haven't been paying attention to the market, have you? Isabel's laughter was soft, terrifyingly genuine. You think I rented this? She touched the emerald necklace. Dominic, the insurance policy on this necklace alone costs more than your quarterly earnings. Dominic scoffed, crossing his arms. Don't lie to me. I know you. I know you're scraping by. You probably maxed out a credit card just to pay for the Uber here. I took the rolls, she corrected him gently. And my driver is currently chatting with your valet about how poorly you tip. Dominic's face turned a shade of puce. Listen to me, he growled. I want you out. Now, take your circus act and leave before I have security drag you out by your hair. You're ruining the aesthetic. The aesthetic, Isabel mused, looking around the garden. You always were obsessed with how things looked, rather than what they were worth. That's why your company is hemorrhaging cash, isn't it? Dominic froze. What did you say? I said, your balance sheet is a tragedy. Isabel said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. You're leveraged at 4-1. You missed a covenant payment on Tuesday, and you're praying that Serafina's dowry hits your account by Monday morning so you don't default on the Series B notes. Dominic took a step back, looking at her with genuine horror. How? How do you know that? That's confidential financial data. I make it my business to know about failing assets, Isabel said, brushing a piece of invisible lint from his lapel. I work in crisis management, Dominic. And you are the definition of a crisis. Who told you? He demanded, panic rising in his chest. Was it Silas? Did he talk? It doesn't matter who told me, Isabel said. What matters is that you are standing on a precipice, Dominic. And instead of begging for a parachute, you're trying to push the only person who can save you. Save me. Dominic laughed, a high, hysterical sound. You? You can't save a lemonade stand, let alone a multinational corporation. Get out of my sight, Isabel. You're delusional. Am I? Isabel smiled. It was the smile of a predator who had just tasted blood. Careful, Dominic. I could buy this venue and turn it into a parking lot before they serve the cake. And if you're not careful, I might just turn you into the attendant. She turned her back on him, signaling the twins to follow. Enjoy your wedding, Dominic. While it lasts. She walked away, leaving him trembling in the hydrangeas. He told himself she was bluffing. She had to be. She was just trying to scare him. But as he watched her walk back into the crowd, commanding the attention of every billionaire in the room, a cold knot of dread tightened in his stomach. He checked his watch. It was 4:45 p.m. Little did he know, he had exactly 15 minutes left of being a free man. At 5 p.m., the foreclosure notice in Isabel's clutch would become active, and the delusional woman he had just insulted would legally own the ground he was standing on. From the vantage point of the VIP tent, Serafina watched the interaction between her fiancé and the woman in blue with narrowing eyes. She didn't know who the woman was, but she knew what she represented, a threat. Serafina had spent her entire life in high society. She knew the language of power, and right now, the woman in the midnight velvet was speaking it louder than anyone else in the garden. The guests were staring at her, whispering about her emeralds, analyzing her children. Who is she? Serafina snapped at her maid of honor, her knuckles white around her bouquet. Why is Dominic talking to her in the bushes? I heard someone say it's his ex, the maid of honor whispered, looking terrified. The one he told us about. The waitress. That is not a waitress, Serafina hissed. She looked at the way Isabel held herself, spine steel straight, chin high. She looked at the terrified expression on Dominic's face. Jealousy, cold and sharp, twisted in Serafina's gut. It wasn't jealousy born of love. Serafina didn't love Dominic enough for that. It was the jealousy of ownership. Dominic was her asset. His money was her bailout. And this woman looked like she was about to seize the property. Serafina threw her bouquet onto a chair and marched down the steps of the dais, her tulle skirt rustling aggressively. She wasn't going to let some ghost from the past upstage her on her wedding day. She was a sterling, in name, at least, and she knew how to handle interlopers. She arrived just as Isabel was turning to leave the alcove. "Excuse me," Serafina announced, her voice shrill enough to cut through the ambient conversation nearby. "I don't recall seeing trash on the seating chart." The music didn't stop, but the conversations around them did. Guests turned, sensing blood in the water. Isabel stopped. She turned slowly, her movement fluid and languid, like a panther disturbed by a noisy insect. She looked at Serafina, at the excessive lace, the nervous sweat beading on her forehead, the desperation in her eyes. "And you must be the bride," Isabel said, her voice smooth as cream. "Serafina, isn't it? My condolences." "Condolences?" Serafina sputtered, her face flushing pink. "This is a celebration. I'm marrying a billionaire. You're just some bitter ex who couldn't keep him. Look at you, dragging these rentals around for sympathy." She pointed a manicured finger at Leo and Julian. "Security. Get this woman and her bastards out of here. They're ruining my photos." Dominic, who had been trying to shrink into the hydrangeas, stepped forward, looking panicked. "Serafina, stop. Don't make a scene." "I'm not making a scene, Dominic. I'm taking out the garbage," Serafina shouted, emboldened by the crowd. "She's trespassing." Isabel didn't move. She simply looked at Serafina with a pity that was far worse than anger. But before she could speak, a small figure stepped between them. It was Leo. He adjusted his tuxedo jacket with a precision that was eerie for a 10-year-old, then looked up at the bride. He didn't look angry. He looked bored. "Technically," Leo said, his voice clear and projecting perfectly to the gathering crowd, "we aren't trespassing. This is a public venue hired for a private event, and we have a valid invitation addressed to Ms. Isabel Greer. Would you like to see the RSVP confirmation?" Serafina blinked, taken aback by the boy's vocabulary. "Shut up, you little brat. Nobody spoke to you." Furthermore, Julian added, stepping up beside his brother, the term bastard is legally defined as a child born out of wedlock. While technically accurate in our case, using it as a pejorative in the 21st century is rather gauche, don't you think? It signals a limited vocabulary. A ripple of laughter went through the crowd. The guests, senators, judges, and CEOs, were suddenly charmed. They loved wit, and these children were weaponized wit. They sound just like Dominic used to, a banker whispered to his wife. Before the alcohol took over, Serafina looked around, realizing the crowd was laughing at her, not with her. Her face twisted into a snarl. Dominic, do something. Tell them to leave. You should listen to him, Leo said to Serafina, pointing at his father. He's calculating the PR damage right now. Look at his eyes. Rapid movement. Sweating. He knows that kicking out his own children in front of the press would drop his stock price by at least 12% by Monday morning. His what? Serafina stared at Dominic. His children? The silence that fell over the group was absolute. The accusation was out. The word was in the air. Isabel placed a hand on Leo's shoulder, a silent signal of pride. She hadn't coached them to say that. That was pure instinct. That was the Cain intellect, refined by her resilience. Well, Dominic? Isabel asked softly, looking at the man who was currently wiping sweat from his upper lip. The bride has a question. Are you going to answer her? Or are you going to keep lying until the end? Dominic looked at Serafina, who was staring at him with wide, horrified eyes. He looked at the crowd, who were holding up their phones, recording every second. He looked at the twins, the living, breathing proof of his past. He had two choices. He could admit the truth, beg for forgiveness, and try to salvage his humanity. Or he could double down on the lie that had built his empire. Dominic Cain was a man who had sold his soul for a penthouse 10 years ago. He wasn't about to buy it back now. They aren't mine, Dominic shouted, the lie tearing out of his throat. The crowd gasped. She's lying. Dominic pointed a shaking finger at Isabel. I told you, Serafina. She's crazy. She's been stalking me for years. I threw her out because she was unfaithful. She slept with half of Chicago and tried to pin the pregnancy on me. Isabel's eyes went cold. It was the final straw. He had insulted her honor. He had rejected his sons to their faces. He had chosen the lie. I took a paternity test. Dominic lied, his voice rising to a hysterical pitch. 10 years ago, it was negative. These boys are nothing to me. They're just props for her con artist games. Julian flinched. It was a small movement, but Isabel felt it. The boy looked at his father, and the light in his eyes dimmed. The curiosity was gone, replaced by a cold, hard finality. Props, Julian whispered. Isabel tightened her grip on her clutch. That was it. He had sealed his fate. He had been given a chance to be a father, and he had chosen to be a coward. Is that your final statement, Dominic? Isabel asked, her voice deadly calm. You are going on record, in front of the press and your shareholders, stating that you have no connection to us? Yes. Dominic roared, trying to regain his dominance. I have no connection to you. You are nothing. You are a fraud. Now get off my property before I have you arrested. Your property, Isabel repeated. She looked at her watch. It was 5:01 p.m. A slow, dangerous smile spread across her face. It was the smile of the executioner lifting the axe. Actually, Dominic, she said, reaching into her clutch and pulling out the black velvet envelope. I think we need to clarify a few things about ownership. She signaled to the large man in the dark suit standing by the terrace entrance, the process server disguised as a guest. He moved forward. Dominic had wanted a show. He had wanted a spectacle. Isabel was about to give him the grand finale of his life. Little did he know, the paper in her hand weighed more than his entire existence. The wind off Lake Michigan picked up, rattling the crystal pendants of the chandeliers hanging inside the open marquee. To the guests watching the confrontation, it felt as though nature itself was holding its breath. Dominic stood on the terrace, chest heaving, his fingers still pointed at Isabel in accusation. He had played his final card, denial. He believed that by screaming loud enough, he could drown out the truth. But truth is a buoyant thing. No matter how hard you push it down, it always surfaces. Isabel didn't shout. She didn't scream back. She simply held the black velvet envelope between two manicured fingers, treating it with the casual indifference one might show a cocktail napkin. You really are consistent, Dominic. Isabel said, her voice cutting through the wind. 10 years ago, you called me a liar to save your ego. Today, you're doing it to save your stock price. But there is a difference between then and now. Get out, Dominic barked, though his eyes were fixed on the envelope with a growing, gnawing dread. I don't want to hear your delusions. The difference, Isabel continued, ignoring him as she stepped closer, is that 10 years ago, I didn't have the budget to prove you wrong. Today, I have the budget to buy your silence. She signaled to the large man in the dark suit, the process server who had been waiting discreetly by the ice sculpture. He moved forward with the inevitability of a glacier. This isn't a prop, Dominic, Isabel said, handing the envelope to the server, who then thrust it into Dominic's trembling hands. And it isn't a paternity test. You already know the truth about the boys, even if you're too cowardly to admit it. No, this is something you care about far more than flesh and blood. Dominic looked down at the envelope. Ms. Isabel Greer was written on the front in his own handwriting, the invitation he had sent to mock her. But the seal had been broken, and something else had been added inside. What is this? Dominic whispered, the fight draining out of him as the weight of the paper settled in his palms. Open it, Serafina demanded from behind him, her voice shrill with panic. Dominic, open it. What does she have on you? Dominic's fingers fumbled with the thick paper. He pulled out a document bound in blue legal backing. It wasn't a love letter. It wasn't a birth certificate. It was a dense, complex financial instrument stamped with the seal of the Illinois State Court. Read the header, Dominic, Isabel commanded softly. Read it out loud so your shareholders can hear. Dominic squinted at the text, his vision blurring. Notice of accelerated debt and foreclosure. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The camera shutters went wild, capturing the precise moment the groom's face turned the color of ash. And who is the claimant? Isabel asked, taking a sip of champagne from a passing waiter's tray. Dominic's eyes scanned down the page to the line listed as creditor. He stopped. He blinked. He read it again. Vanguard Capital, he choked out. Vanguard Capital, Isabel repeated, savoring the syllables. My company. The mystery investor you've been dodging for months? The one holding $40 million of your bad debt? That's me, Dominic. I am Nemesis Holdings. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the wind seemed to die down, as if the elements wanted to hear the pin drop. Dominic looked up from the paper, his eyes wide and hollow. You own my debt. I own the Series B notes, Isabel corrected him, stepping forward until she was toe-to-toe with him. I own the construction loans on your headquarters. I own the patent portfolio you put up as collateral. And as of, she checked her diamond watch. 3 minutes ago, since you failed to secure the waiver, I have exercised my right to accelerate the loan. She plucked the document from his numb fingers and held it up for Serafina to see. It means he's in default, Isabel explained to the horrified bride. The company is insolvent. The assets are frozen. Everything Dominic thinks he owns, this venue, the catering, the tuxedo he's wearing, technically belongs to the creditors now. That's impossible, Dominic stammered, backing away until he hit the ice sculpture. Silas, tell her she's lying. Tell her we have time. Silas, the best man, stepped forward, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else on earth. He looked at the document in Isabel's hand, then at his friend. Dom, Silas whispered, his voice cracking. If she's Vanguard, and if she didn't sign the waiver, then she's right. The grace period ended at 5 p.m. today. It's over. It's not over, Dominic screamed, grabbing Silas by the lapels. We have the merger. Serafina's money. It hits on Monday. Monday is too late, Isabel said coolly. Business doesn't run on could have, or should have, Dominic. It runs on contracts. And you just breached yours. She turned to the crowd, addressing the hundreds of wealthy elites who were watching the spectacle with rapt attention. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the interruption, Isabel announced, her voice projecting clearly. But as the new primary stakeholder of Kane Dynamics, I have to inform you that Mr. Kane is no longer authorized to host events on company dime. This party is officially over budget. She looked back at Dominic. You told me 10 years ago that I was an anchor dragging you down. You said you needed a partner who looked the part. Well, Dominic, look at me now. I don't just look the part. I own the stage. Dominic sank to his knees, not in prayer, but in the sheer physical collapse of a man whose reality had just evaporated. He looked at the document, then at Isabel, then at the twins standing stoically beside her. He realized then that the blizzard hadn't killed her. It had forged her, and the snow he had thrown her into had returned as an avalanche. The transformation of the crowd was instantaneous and brutal. In high society, money is gravity. When it vanishes, so does the respect. Moments ago, Dominic Kane had been a titan, a man to be courted and flattered. Now, as he knelt on the wet stone of the terrace, clutching a foreclosure notice, he was something far worse than a villain. He was a failure. The guests began to back away, creating a wide circle around him as if failure were contagious. The whispers weren't fearful anymore. They were mocking. He was leveraged 40-1. A hedge fund manager scoffed loud enough for Dominic to hear. Amateur hour. And he lied about the kids, a socialite added, looking at the twins with newfound respect. Imagine abandoning those boys. They look like princes. He's finished, Senator Sterling announced, draining his glass. I can't be seen with him. This is a PR nightmare. Dominic looked up, searching for a friendly face. He looked for his groomsmen, but Trent and the others were already taking off their boutonnieres, distancing themselves from the sinking ship. Then, he looked at Serafina. The bride was standing frozen, her face a mask of processing data. She wasn't looking at Dominic with concern. She was looking at the foreclosure document. She was looking at Isabel's emeralds. And she was doing the math. Serafina. Dominic rasped, reaching a hand out toward her. Baby, please. It's just a legal maneuver. We can fix this. Once we're married, your trust fund will. My trust fund. Serafina interrupted, her voice sharp as broken glass. She looked at him, and the mask of the adoring fiancé finally slipped. Beneath it was the cold, hard calculation of a woman who had just realized she had bet on the wrong horse. You told me you were solvent, Serafina hissed. You told me the company was worth billions. You told me the prenup was a formality because you had so much money you needed to protect me. I do. I will. Dominic begged. Isabel is just, she's bluffing. She is the owner of Vanguard Capital, you idiot. Serafina shrieked, throwing her hands up. She's not bluffing. She owns you. And if she owns you, then you have nothing. Isabel watched the interaction with a dark satisfaction. She had predicted this. She knew that a love built on transaction would crumble the moment the currency was devalued. He's all yours, Serafina, Isabel said dryly. Although, without the company assets, I believe his net worth is currently -4 million. I hope your love is strong enough to handle the debt collectors. Serafina looked at Dominic, then at the guests who were judging her, waiting to see if she would stand by her man. She looked down at the 10-carat diamond on her finger, a ring Dominic had bought on credit. I think, Serafina said, her voice trembling with rage, that there has been a mistake. Little did Dominic know, the humiliation wasn't over. The financial ruin was just the first wave. The personal rejection was about to hit him with the force of a tsunami. The wind whipped across the terrace, but Serafina didn't feel the cold. She only felt the burning humiliation of a gambler who had just realized she was holding a losing hand. She looked at the man kneeling on the wet stone, the man she had agreed to marry not for love, not for companionship, but for the safety of his bank account. Serafina, Dominic pleaded, reaching for the hem of her lace gown. Don't listen to her. We can fight the foreclosure. My lawyers are the best in the city. We just need to sign the marriage license. Once the Sterling Trust merges with my assets, we can pay off the debt. We can fix this. Isabel let out a soft, dark laugh. It was the sound of a judge delivering a verdict. Oh, Dominic, Isabel said, stepping closer. You really didn't do your due diligence, did you? She turned her gaze to the bride. Tell him, Serafina. Tell him why you were so eager to move the wedding date up. Tell him why you insisted on a generous prenup that guaranteed you a payout regardless of the marriage's duration. Serafina froze. Her face drained of color, leaving her makeup standing out like a mask. I don't know what you're talking about, Serafina stammered, backing away. I think you do, Isabel countered. My analysts ran a background check on the Sterling Family Trust when we acquired Dominic's debt. We wanted to assess his liquidity. Do you know what we found? Dominic looked between the two women, confusion warring with his panic. What? What did you find? The Sterling Trust is empty, Dominic, Isabel revealed, her voice calm and devastating. Her father gambled away the shipping fortune 3 years ago. The Hamptons estate is in foreclosure. The yacht was repossessed last month. Serafina isn't your savior. She's just another drowning person trying to climb onto your back. Dominic stared at his bride, his mouth opening and closing like a fish on dry land. Is that true? Serafina's silence was the loudest sound in the garden. She looked at Dominic with pure loathing, not because he was broke, but because he had exposed her own poverty. You lied to me, Dominic whispered, the betrayal hitting him harder than the bankruptcy. You were just using me for my money, and you were using me for my name. Serafina shrieked, finally snapping. Don't act like a victim, you fraud. You paraded me around like a prize poodle to boost your stock price. At least I was honest about being a mercenary. You're just a liar. The illusion of the perfect wedding shattered completely. The guests, who had been watching with bated breath, let out a collective murmur of shock. It was a double deception, a marriage built on two empty bank accounts trying to defraud each other. Serafina looked around the garden. She saw the judgment in the eyes of her peers. She saw the cameras recording her shame. She realized there was no money to be had here, no golden parachute, no rescue. She made a calculation. If she stayed, she was the wife of a bankrupt fraud. If she left, she was the victim of a con artist. Serafina grabbed the tulle veil attached to her hair and ripped it off. The expensive fabric tore with a jagged sound. She threw it onto the ground, where it landed in a puddle of spilled champagne. I'm done, she announced, her voice shaking. I am not marrying a man who can't even pay his own mortgage. Serafina, wait. Dominic scrambled to his feet, trying to grab her arm. The ring. Give me back the ring. It's worth $100,000. Serafina stopped. She looked at the 10-carat diamond on her finger. Then she looked at Isabel, who was watching with an amused expression. Actually, Dominic, Serafina sneered, twisting the ring off her finger. I had this appraised yesterday, just in case. She threw the ring at his chest. It bounced off his tuxedo lapel and clattered onto the stone patio. It's cubic zirconia, she spat. Just like you. Fake. With a final swirl of her gown, the bride marched back down the aisle, her heels clicking a rhythm of retreat. Her mother and bridesmaids scrambled to follow her, leaving Dominic standing alone at the altar of his own destruction. He looked down at the fake ring lying in the dirt. He looked at the empty archway where his future was supposed to be. And then, slowly, terrified, he turned to face the only person left standing, Isabel. Nature abhors a vacuum, and power abhors a loser. With the bride gone and the groom exposed as a fraud, the energy in the garden shifted violently. The guests didn't leave. They didn't flee the awkwardness. Instead, they did what high society always does. They realigned with the new center of gravity. Senator Sterling, who had just watched his niece flee, didn't chase after her. Instead, he walked straight past Dominic as if the groom were invisible. He walked up to Isabel, a charming smile plastered on his face. Ms. Greer, the senator said, extending his hand. I must say that was quite a negotiation. I didn't realize Vanguard Capital was expanding into local real estate. We go where the value is, Senator, Isabel replied, shaking his hand firmly. Or where the mismanagement is. In this case, it was both. Well, if you're looking for new investment opportunities for the Kane portfolio, the senator continued, handing her a gold-embossed business card. My office would be delighted to consult with you. We value stability. It was the first domino. Suddenly, Isabel was surrounded. Bankers, investors, and socialites. The very people Dominic had spent 10 years trying to impress, turned their backs on him and swarmed his ex-wife. Isabel, darling, is that vintage Oscar de la Renta? Ms. Greer, I have a proposition for your crisis management team. Those boys are absolutely striking, Isabel. They must attend St. Jude's? My grandson is there. Dominic stood on the periphery of his own wedding, watching the woman he had called nothing become the sun around which his entire world orbited. He was a ghost at his own funeral. No one looked at him. No one spoke to him. He had become irrelevant. Isabel navigated the praise with cool grace, but she didn't lose focus. She saw Dominic standing by the fountain, shivering not from the cold, but from the shock. She excused herself from the senator and walked toward him, the crowd parting to let her pass. The twins followed, their silent judgment weighing heavier than any gavel. Dominic saw her coming, and instinct took over. The arrogance was gone. The denial was gone. All that was left was the desperate, clawing need to survive. He looked at Isabel, then he looked at the twins. And for the first time, he didn't see props. He saw leverage. He saw a lifeline. Isabel, he croaked, his voice raw. Please. You can't do this. You can't destroy me. I built this company from nothing. It's my life. And you build it on my back. Isabel reminded him. You build it on the money you saved by throwing me out. You build it on the lies you told about your family. I was scared. Dominic cried, tears mixing with the sweat on his face. I was young and stupid. I thought I had to be alone to succeed. But I see now. I see I was wrong. He dropped to his knees again, reaching out toward the boys. Leo and Julian took a synchronized step back, their faces masks of distaste. Boys, Dominic pleaded, looking up at them. Leo, Julian, I'm your father. I know I haven't been there, but I want to be. I want to know you. Look at all this. He gestured vaguely at the foreclosure notice. If your mother takes the company, I'll have nothing to leave you. I'm doing this for you. Tell her. Tell her to give me a chance. It was a pathetic, manipulative play. He was trying to use the children he had rejected as human shields against his financial ruin. Isabel felt a surge of rage, but she tamped it down. She didn't need to defend them. She had raised them to defend themselves. She looked at Leo. Do you have anything to say to him? Leo stepped forward. He looked at the man kneeling in the dirt, a man in a ruined tuxedo, begging for mercy he hadn't earned. You said you were young, Leo said, his voice steady and clear. But you were 28. My mother was 22. She was younger than you, and she was alone in a blizzard. She didn't abandon us. Dominic flinched. Leo, please. You said you want to know us, Julian added, stepping up beside his brother. But you don't want to know us. You want to know the heirs to a fortune. You want assets. But we aren't assets, Mr. Kane. We are people. I am your father. Dominic sobbed, reaching for Julian's hand. Julian pulled his hand away sharply. He looked at Dominic with eyes that were ancient and cold. Our father died 10 years ago, Julian said, delivering the words with the precision of a surgeon. He died the moment he closed the door on a pregnant woman. You aren't our father. You're just a stranger who owes our mother a lot of money. And you're trespassing, Leo finished. Dominic slumped back on his heels, shattered. The rejection was absolute. He had thought he could charm them, buy them, or guilt them. But he had forgotten that children raised in the fire of resilience can smell a fake from a mile away. Isabel stepped between her sons and the man on the ground. She was the wall, the fortress, the iron curtain. You heard them, she said softly. They are done with you. And so am I. Isabel raised her hand, signaling the head of security, a man she had hired specifically for this moment. Mr. Henderson, she called out. The large man stepped forward. Yes, Miss Greer. Mr. Kane is no longer a guest at this venue, Isabel stated, her voice carrying over the wind. In fact, as the new owner of the property holding company, I am formally trespassing him. Please remove him from the premises immediately. Isabel, no. Dominic scrambled backward. You can't do this. This is my wedding. The press is watching. Let them watch, Isabel said. Let them see what happens when you don't pay your debts. Two security guards grabbed Dominic by the arms. He struggled, his shoes scraping against the stone, his tuxedo bunching up. It was a mirror image of the night 10 years ago, but the roles were perfectly reversed. Isabel, he screamed as they dragged him toward the side gate. You're nothing. You hear me? You're nothing. Isabel watched him go. She remembered the sound of his voice shouting those same words down the stairwell of their apartment building. Back then, they had broken her. Now, they were just noise. I am everything, she whispered to the wind. She watched as they threw him out of the service entrance, onto the gravel driveway, exactly where he belonged. The heavy iron gates slammed shut with a finality that echoed in her bones. The garden was silent. The guests were staring at her with a mixture of fear and awe. She had walked in a ghost and walked out a queen. Ms. Greer. Silas, the best man, approached her cautiously. He held out a set of keys. These are the keys to the company headquarters. And the safe. Dom. He kept them in the suite. Isabel took the keys. Thank you, Silas. You may send your resume to my office on Monday. I'll see if we have a use for a lawyer who knows where the bodies are buried. Silas nodded, looking relieved to have survived the purge. Isabel turned to the twins. The adrenaline was fading, replaced by a deep, bone-weary satisfaction. The The storm clouds above finally broke, but instead of a deluge, a single ray of golden evening light pierced through, illuminating the wet garden. "Are you okay?" she asked them, smoothing Leo's hair. "We're fine," Leo said, looking at the empty gate. "He was smaller than I thought he would be." "He was just a man," Julian agreed. "A sad man." Isabel smiled. "Yes, just a man." She took their hands. "Come on, let's go home. I promised you pizza if you behaved, and I think you've earned extra toppings." They walked back down the limestone steps, past the stunned valet, past the Rolls Royce. They didn't look back at the mansion, or the guests, or the ruined wedding. They didn't need to. They had what they came for. Justice wasn't loud. It wasn't a scream. It was the quiet click of a gate closing on the past. 1 year later, the cover of Forbes magazine displayed a woman in a midnight blue power suit, flanked by two identical boys who looked like young chess grandmasters. The headline read, "The Phoenix Dynasty, How Isabel Greer Built an Empire from the Ashes." Isabel sat in her office, the corner office of the newly rebranded Greer Kane Tower, and looked at the magazine. The article detailed her acquisition of Kane Dynamics, the restructuring that had saved thousands of jobs, and the launch of her new charitable foundation for single mothers. The company was thriving. The stock price had tripled. The Kane name was slowly being rehabilitated, not because of Dominic, but because of his sons. Dominic Kane was a footnote in the article. A single paragraph mentioned his bankruptcy, his disbarment from the Business Bureau, and his current employment as a junior consultant at a mid-tier firm in Ohio. He had tried to sue, of course, but Isabel's lawyers had buried him in paperwork until he ran out of money to buy stamps. There was a knock on the door. Leo and Julian walked in, dropping their backpacks on the leather sofa. They were 11 now, taller, sharper. "Mom," Leo said, "Julian bet me he could beat your stock portfolio algorithm." "And I did," Julian grinned. "By 0.2%. Isabel laughed, the sound warm and free. She looked at her sons, then out the window at the city she had conquered. She remembered the girl in the snow, the girl who thought she was nothing. She wished she could go back and whisper in that girl's ear. She would tell her to hold on. She would tell her that the cold doesn't last forever. Dominic had wanted to teach her a lesson that day. He wanted to teach her that power belongs to the ruthless. But he was wrong. Isabel smiled, closing the magazine. He wanted to teach her a lesson, but he ended up becoming the curriculum. Family, Isabel's story isn't just about revenge. It is a reminder of a terrifying truth. The most dangerous person in the world is a woman who has been stripped of everything, because she has nothing left to lose and everything to gain. Dominic thought he could bury her, but he forgot that she was a seed. If this story ignited a fire in your chest, if you believe that resilience is the ultimate revenge, please hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Help us grow this family of truth seekers. And if you enjoyed seeing a billionaire get exactly what he deserved, you are going to love the video on your screen right now. It's about a husband who thought he could replace his wife, only to realize he had just evicted his lucky charm. Click it, and let's continue this journey together. I love you. I appreciate you. And I will see you in the next one.